The 1930s was a particularly interesting period in design. But let's go back to the late 1920s for the context of where we were as the 30s broke. There'd been Black Thursday, the Wall Street crash had caused worldwide depression and misery. Prohibition was gripping America, and there were assassinations and gangster killings in places as the mafia got the upper hand. Depression often brings out underground movements, and I think the prohibition set the mafia up forever. It was in fact repealed in December 1933, but it was a fairly grim time. On the political front, there were a few nasty things going on. Hitler rose to power in 1933. Also, Mussolini in Italy had been the Prime Minister since 1922, and he reckoned he was the only person that could run the country, and he gradually dismantled democratic institutions, so by 1925 he was a dictator and stayed until he was executed in 1945. In Germany, the Nuremberg laws brought in some very nasty racist and anti-Semitic legislation, and they were enacted in the Reichstag in 1935, in September 35. Franco in Spain rose to power through the 1936 Spanish Civil War, and after winning it he remained in power until he died in 1975, but he did restore the monarchy before he passed away. On a sunnier note, over in America, the news was a lot better. In the 1932 presidential election, Roosevelt defeated the Republican President Hoover in a landslide. So Roosevelt took office while the United States was in the middle of the Great Depression and the worst economic crisis in the country's history. But during his first 100 days, he too signed a lot of presidential orders, and there was a profusion of executive orders that started the New Deal. It was a variety of programs that brought hope and relief, recovery and reform. He'd actually been paralysed in 1922, but had been in public life most of his life. He was the governor of New York from 1928 to 1932, so he had political experience. And he actually was president for 4 terms before they brought the 2-term rule in, but he died 11 weeks into his 4th term. But he was president for a lot of the 1930s. On the design front, there were 2 camps that went right the way back to almost medieval times, and of course the classical period goes back to ancient Greece. But there were 2 camps. People either designed in the classic style with pediments, columns and that sort of thing, like the buildings on the left, or there was the ecclesiastical Gothic style with pointed windows, vaults and tracery, and that went through a Gothic revival in the Victorian period, and there was also the Renaissance and classical revival. So design tended to be in those 2 camps until people started to think differently. So in the art and design world from the 1920s, the tradition was backward looking to either classical or Gothic. It was romantic at times. Art was often representative or religious. Stylistic preferences were for either classic or Gothic, but engineering had made a difference. People thought simple engineering structures that worked well. There was a phrase that Ruskin used, firmness, commodity and delight. And a lot of engineering structures had that. Just look at the Iron Bridge in Shropshire and 1 or 2 other lovely engineering structures. But there were tentative moves to simplify right the way through the Victorian period, which created the arts and crafts movement and subsequently Art Nouveau with its sinuous curves. But the idea of doing something different had been brewing for ages. On ships, this is the lounge of the Berengaria, which was the Imperator, as I said in my great liners talk, designed by Mevis and Davis, who did the Ritz Hotel and the RAC Club. The Prince of Wales used to travel on this as an ordinary passenger. Well, ordinary. Lord Renfrew, he went on board, and he went on this and the Olympic, the surviving sister of the Titanic trio. But this is the sort of space they would have lived in. I mentioned the other day about P&O having a fairly revolutionary ship with electric engines, but inside, and I've shown these pictures before for those of you who saw the last talk, it was like a baronial hunting lodge and really quite traditional, heavy and brown. There's the swimming pool, which looks like a Pompeian swimming pool, but a very peculiar scale. Look at the height, they're almost touching the ceiling up on the gallery there. But the roots of the revolution came from the arts and crafts movement. People like William Morris liked the wholesomeness of handcrafted stuff. It's actually only available to the very rich, but that's another matter. The Art Nouveau movement, which had curves and twirls and lots of florid details, but it was a simplification with a touch of nature. Then there was the Viennese Successionist movement, which I'll come on to in a minute. They started to simplify things. So in the earlier 20th century, I mentioned the Bauhaus school the other day, architectural simplification, the removal of detail, and experiments with new structural materials led to the modern movement. There was colour, shape, and other cultures like Chinese, Indian and Egyptian came in. But there was a desire to integrate art, decor and lighting into structures, which had not been done before. Lighting was an add-on, and integrating art, it was not always done. It was hung on the walls afterwards. So it was breaking the shackles of old traditions, and certainly the First World War boosted that desire for revolution and change. I mentioned Vienna just now. This building by Otto Wagner and Karlsplatz is 1899. It's not classic, it's not Gothic, it's like a little jewel box in many respects, but there's very little reference to those earlier styles. They were beginning to think about doing things differently. This is a post office. Another Otto Wagner building, 1904-1906. Still a very traditional building. It's got windows in walls. There's a little pavilion at each side with a statue on the top. It's got a cornice. So it sort of feels traditional, classical, but there is no classical detail on it. It's tile, it's scraped of detail, and very simple. Here's another one by the Loos House in Vienna by Adolf Loos, 1911. Very similar columns to the ones I showed you in the Europa's Lounge the other day. Simple columns, simple capitals, but interesting little windows and details above. This is when it starts to get really interesting. Auguste Perret, the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris, 1913. There's nothing traditional in the detailing of that. All right, it has two pilaster panels. These are things that you call pilasters, but they go right up to the top. There's no capitals, there's no cornice, bas-relief details, and down here as well. And a strange order of windows. They're framed, but it's almost scraped away classical. It's got a traditional form, but there's no tradition in the detail. Then, of course, as Vivian's told you, there was a rage about things found in Egypt, Tutankhamun's tomb, for example. There is an Egyptian house in Penzance, and this is the Egyptian Hall in London. They went over the top with Egyptian details in Paris. This is the Luxor Palace Cinema. And when you look at the details, there's cobras, a mosaic, inspired by finds in Egypt. And when you get inside, there's little sculptures of Tutankhamun himself. And the sort of winged sun is a very common detail that got into the vocabulary. And it turned up in many things in the next couple of decades, as we shall see. I mentioned in the Great Liners talk that there was the Exposition des Arts Décoratifs in Paris in 1925. It was very influential on decoration. It wasn't so influential on architecture. That was the Bauhaus movement. But look at some of those pavilions. They're almost like cake decorations or jewel boxes, things you'd have on your dressing table to put cufflinks or earrings or that sort of thing. But look at some of the pavilions. They stepped. They were like pyramids, inspired by Mayan things. Bas-reliefs, things happening in threes, 3 windows, 3 panels, 3 gaps there, where traditional things have 4 columns, 6 columns, 8 columns. So there was a difference. It's quite simple forms. There's another one that's piled up. Inside, furniture began to change. It's the sort of stuff you remember in your granny's house, isn't it, really, if they bought reasonably modern stuff. But look at the carpet, jazzy patterns and interesting things, probably inspired by Oriental examples. So there was a divergence. So architecture became stark and often technical, with challenging architectural forms. Industrial design brought visual delight as well as practicality. Fabrics got jazzy and abstract. In music, there was jazz, there was atonal music. The traditional forms were abandoned. And in art movements, we've had there's cubism and many substrands. If anybody goes, I'm a Tate member, and whenever you go there and you see these exhibitions of this period, they were all fighting each other in smoky coffee houses and bars, all doing each other down. But there were substrands, but they were all doing something different. Quite a lot of motifs, though, get repeated. Rays radiating, like those from the sun thing in that cinema I showed you, rounded corners, stripes, often in threes, and they often integrated lighting. Here's a poster, actually from the 1920s, which shows a simplification of forms. It's not representational, it's an impression. This is of Marseille. And different materials were played with. This is a screen of 1924 in iron and brass. Clarence Cliff, famous potter, and Enoch Bolton, 1930s pottery. I said things, firmness, commodity and delight. Try holding that teacup with those rather strange triangular handles. A little difficult, but look at the jazzy patterns, the sunrise. These sort of things were coming into fashion. Found some Art Deco wallpaper borders, the rays again. How many people's houses had that sort of fireplace? Leaping gazelles turn up ever such a lot. There's the stripes, there's the rounded corners, black and white. Very much what we now call Art Deco. But suburban housing, speculative developments were going ahead. This is the sort of house that people were buying from, for silly sums now. Woodcock Hill, £65 to £1,200 freehold. But they often incorporated front doors or bullseye windows with rising sun leaded lights. But 1929, Mies van der Rohe designed the German pavilion for the Barcelona World's Fair, a stunning modern building. This is actually a recreation of it. A group of Catalan architects built a replica because it was torn down when the exhibition finished in, after 1929, and I saw it about 10 years ago. It had recently been finished. But look at it. A simple floor, a grey wall, simple chromium columns, a flat slab on the roof. The plan of it's down the bottom. It doesn't do anything, it was just a pavilion. You couldn't live in it, sleep in it or whatever. But the Barcelona chair, shown on the right hand side there, is an absolute classic of modern design. Two pieces of chromium metal crossing with very simple cushions. An absolute design icon. In America, they were a little more fancy. If anybody's been to Los Angeles, this is the Bullock's Wilshire store in Los Angeles. And there were often transportation themes getting in. And in the porte cochere, where you come in your car and you get out and the doors open for you and you get into the shop, look up at the ceiling, and those two ceiling panels, people on the television won't be able to see, but there's a steam train, a three-funneled liner, an airship, an aeroplane, small planes. The transport was celebrated as part of the art. And look at the colours, very much 1930s, what people call Art Deco colours. I'll come on to that definition in a minute. Here's another building, the Eastern Columbia building by Claude Beelman in 1930, again in downtown Los Angeles. It only took 9 months to build, but the headquarters of this, it was a store chain, and it was renovated in 2006, and it's now condominiums for live and work use. And then the really grand one, Chrysler, opened 27th of May 1930. On the left, the outside, there's the foyer there on the right-hand side. A glorious piece of architecture from the turn of the 1920s into the 1930s. There's some of the details on the left-hand side. And for 11 months, it was the tallest building in the world. But the Empire State Building came along 11 months later and beat it in 1931. So there's a bit of background as to what was happening in the architectural and building world. What was happening at sea. A bit slower to pick up at sea. This is the Empress of Britain, Canadian Pacific liner. Grand liner, did world voyages in great style. But inside there was Oriental inspiration for some of the rooms. On the ceiling there's that sign that was explained as being what the Germans used as a swastika, but the other way around. It's often found in Eastern temples and fretwork that has an Oriental feel about it. That's the Cathay Smoking Lounge, Cathay being an Oriental name. There's a suite. Funny having a fireplace in a suite, but they did. This is the first class dining room. I mentioned earlier integrating lighting. So there's these bands of light and panels in the ceiling. There's a clock up there. How many people remember those rectangular lozenge watches? The floor, linoleum, it wouldn't have been carpet. Quite jazzy, almost psychedelic pattern there. But not all rooms were more modern. This is the Mayfair Lounge, and what they did in those days, they gave a room to each person. There wasn't an integrated approach to the interior design of the whole ship as there is these days. That hadn't happened yet. I'll come on to that in a minute. So this one is rather more traditional, with cornices, columns and a vaulted ceiling. But rather more fun was the Knickerbocker Bar. Remember the cartoonist Heath Robinson? He did the cartoons for that, so he's got little aeroplanes and things going around there. It doesn't actually look restful, but it was a really interesting room, and he did the artwork for the murals. So they aren't all streamlined and smooth. This is a set of furniture. We recognise the sort of splay legs from the Festival of Britain. They became popular at that time. But the furniture there, I can't say I particularly like it, but that was sort of more connected with the 1925 exhibition than some of the architectural stuff that was going on. But at sea, the Italians took a bit of a lead in stylish ship design. This is a ship for Lloyd Triestino called the Victoria. There's a postcard of it, and there's a black and white picture of her arriving in Venice on her maiden voyage. But 1931, not very long after that exhibition, look at the inside. Sofas in red leather with the leather showing through in three stripes along the wall, a ship on the wall, and a fireplace with stripes and curves as it goes into the fireplace. A very modern interpretation. A couple of other rooms from that ship. Rather gaudy floor again. If you were feeling a little bit queasy, I don't think that black and yellow would make you feel very comfortable, or the bay leaves swaying. But that was the forward observation lounge and another bar on the left. But 1931, very modern for its time. Britain did two motor ships, which were quite simple inside. I won't dwell on these two, they weren't cutting, but the reason I do include this is the rather nice brochure. Not quite the Cassandra Normandy one, but interesting nonetheless in its graphic style. But the swimming pool I always find amusing. Georgic was for White Star Line, same company that owned the Titanic. I do find it rather strange that they have an iceberg with penguins on it at the end of their swimming pool, considering one of the antecedents had had a nasty encounter with an iceberg in 1912. Another piece of graphics from that period, the White Empresses, which the Empress of Britain was one. There's an interior from the Empress of Japan. She changed her name and became the Empress of Scotland. But the integration of lighting with those bands of light and the chandelier in the middle show the sort of thing that was being experimented with. The Normandy had Lalique-like fittings. This one was British. And a slightly oriental twist to those columns on the Empress of Japan. But not everybody caught the modern movement at once. Super cinemas were a new breed. And here they went back to full Gothic. This is the Granada Tooting, and it's got some Roman and Byzantine details, and it's from 1931, and it was one of the greatest British super cinemas. It's now used for bingo, as you can see the bingo thing where the screen used to be, but it had 3,700 capacity. In New York, the Waldorf Astoria built a new hotel in 1931. This is the approach, the canopy, but inside the foyer is a delightful piece of simple modern design. Not very good for people with disabilities. You've got a flight of stairs to get up, but they didn't worry about those sort of things then, sadly. But the urns were common on the Normandy and on the Queen Mary, and very simple architectural forms and a very nice interior. Napier in New Zealand had an earthquake on the 3rd of February 1931, 7.8 on the Richter scale. As you know, New Zealand is quite riven by fault lines, and Napier was destroyed. And a lot of rebuilds were done in what was then the modern style. And the Daily Telegraph building here dates from 1932. It's an Art Deco city, and they have Art Deco festivals every year and bring out old cars. So it's quite a fantastic, I've not been there yet, but it's a place to visit. Strand Palace Hotel, experimenting with glass. These are the sort of things that went into the Wurlitzers that came up out of the ground in cinemas, and the balustrades there were illuminated from the inside. As I said, cinemas were a new building form. They often incorporated cafes, and they had a flagship tower to say, "Here I am," an exclamation mark. And there's another one with almost like an aerofoil pointing out where it is. And because structures were evolving, you had to have windows in corners where you would normally expect masonry. And look at those side buildings. They often built a block of shops either side. And the three stripes turn up again, the banding, and even the flagpole has three bands on each of its supports. That motif keeps turning up. In Italy, I mentioned the Rex the other day, the one that went for the record. She had a running mate, the Conte di Savoia. This is a colorized picture of her leaving Trieste. And inside, there was quite a lot of stone and marble, simple design, and interesting ceilings. Integrated ceilings and lighting for the first time. There's a gallery down the side. The Italians used richer, darker materials than they often used black, and made a feature of sconce lighting. And this is the card room with interesting lights that were a bit of a hallmark of this designer. They often passed each other quite close, as I said when I showed the Augustus and the Giulio Cesare the other day, sometimes too close. And this is the Rex point passing the Conte di Savoia. Music Hall, Radio City. Has anybody been? New York? Fantastic building. It's on a corner, and inside you go into a foyer with a grand sweep of a staircase with a lacquered wall and mural. I think that was the inspiration for something that went on the Rotterdam, and before it the New Amsterdam in the Ritz-Carlton room. But inside, the auditorium is stunning. There are 3 levels of galleries, of balconies at the top, but it's not until you turn round from one of those balconies and look at the stage that you realize what a revolution in shape, design and style had come about. There's the view of the auditorium from the balcony. What a stunner. Absolutely amazing. In Britain, we were a little slower to take things up, but probably the 2 most important early modern buildings were the De Loire Pavilion by Mendelssohn and Chimaev of 1935, clearly inspired by the Barcelona Pavilion, slabs of concrete, diaphragms of glass, this time with a curve, and Hornsey Town Hall in North London by Reginald Uren. He went on to build the John Lewis store in Oxford Street, but influenced by the Dutch, Hilversum Town Hall in particular. He got an RIBA medal for that. But inside the De Loire Pavilion, there's a wonderful sweep of glass, and at the top of the spiral staircase. And integrating lighting and architecture again, there's this pendant light going down the spiral staircase core. Absolutely stunning building. If you don't know it, do go and have a wander round. I mentioned materials, glass lit from the inside, a bit like Strand Palace Hotel. These cinemas had interesting organs. One of those is preserved in the Music Museum at Kew, if ever you get the chance to go and see it. I went to a music and skiffle evening there, and this thing came up out of the ground. There's the Muswell Hill Odeon, super cinemas of the 30s. This was 1936. And of course it got into Hollywood movies. In graphics, railway companies started using a printing process that used 9 colours. So you've got this stylized, rather almost painted by numbers type flat graphics. But it was very popular at the time. London Transport used it, the railway companies used it. There are books and books of railway posters which are fascinating. This is just one that grabbed my attention because it's near where I was born. On the railways and the roads, streamlining started to come in. And this is the Chrysler Airflow and the Union Pacific Streamline Express train from 1934. The Brits got in on the act as well, and if you go to the National Railway Museum in York, you can see on the left the A4, which Mallard got the world steam record, and the coronation from the LMS that came the year after. Actually 1937, there was the coronation. So 35 and 37, Brits got in on the Streamlined Act. This chap, Raymond Loewy, I'll mention him later, was an industrial designer of enormous influence. There's a tram car that he designed there. He also did the logo for United Airlines. But design started getting into domestic equipment, cigarette lighter, vacuum cleaner, and the invention of Bakelite meant that new shapes could be moulded, and that was a picture of that radio I found in a book. But I went into the Black Country Museum in Dudley, where they've got a pair of semi-detached cast iron houses, and there was the same thing. I saw it in the summer on display as an exhibit in the museum. So that was a departure that new materials made possible. We often had architects coming from abroad in the 1930s because they got out of Germany, and Berthold Lebetkin set up practice in Britain. And in Plumstead in southeast London, on a road called Genesta Road, he built a short terrace of 4 terraced houses in the absolutely modern style. The balconies are exactly the same as High Point 1 in Highgate, because he then went on to build that block of flats which are grade 1 listed. These are grade 2 star, and a friend of mine's brother lived in one of them, so I've actually been all round the inside of one of those houses, in a very neat and compact plan. It didn't really change the world of domestic architecture for another 20 years, but it was a good start. In 1934, the architectural firm Tecton built the Regent's Park penguin pool, and that's grade 1 listed, although penguins don't live in it anymore, because apparently the slopes are not good for them, but it's a stunning structure. The amount of iron and steel that went into that, those 2 ramps to make them work, because they just interlock like two half circles. Very, very clever design. Sometimes ships picked up technology from the aircraft industry. Kalakala had a mixed history. She was a very primitive hull with steam engine, and there was an explosion on board, and they rebuilt the upper works using aircraft technology, and this lasted until 2015. I'm surprised she wasn't preserved, but that rather unusual riverboat is a primitive hull but with a streamlined 1930s upper works. I won't say much about the Normandy apart from the fact that she was probably the liner of the 20th century. I said quite a lot and showed quite a lot of pictures on her in the Great Liners talk, the first one I gave. But she was an absolute stunner. An integrated external design with a lot of Art Deco interior work, more decorative than architectural, but she was a most amazing liner. And I think the best thing that ever came out of the 1930s in terms of integrated design. And as I said in the talk the other day, she had an interesting and scientifically evolved hull shape. But of course, liners weren't the only stars. There were movie stars, and here's Clark Gable and Carole Lombard. Sadly, Carole Lombard died in an air crash, but Clark Gable had a Duesenberg, model JN of 1935. It would do 130 miles an hour. There were only 2 of them made. The other one was for Gary Cooper, and they were valued in 2018 at 16.6 million each. Now that rare. Going back to ships though, design went to sea with the Orient Line. I did mention briefly, but not such a nice picture as this groundbreaking ship in 1935, not externally. Externally she was quite ordinary. But inside, the combination of Colin Anderson and Brian O'Rourke had a set of design rules that said nothing fancy, nothing excessive, nothing heavy, nothing that doesn't need to be there. So the interiors were simple columns, simple rugs, light curtains, chairs that you didn't get sweaty back with when you were in the tropics. There were no doubt the odd peach mirrors and that sort of thing. Marion Dawn rugs. That's the gallery where the funnel goes up through the middle, and you had to go down it to get to the dance space at the far end. I'll come on to her later sister in a minute, because I've got more pictures of that and it tells a bit more. The Batory, very similar to that ship, the Victoria, that I showed you, built for the Poles. Poles paid for her in Polish coal to the shipyard, and this was 1936, April 36. This is actually a post-war picture because it's got radar, but she was built in 36. But behind those windows there was an absolutely stunning room. How's that for a forward-facing lounge? It's as good as some of those other things that we've seen. The Italians were very good at their 30s interiors and rather underrated. Now, world events. Of course, the Berlin Olympics happened in 1936. What a piece of branding that was. It's always funny how street traders seem to manage to keep their kiosk when you want a vista that's clean and tidy. They did it in London, they do it here. The street trader managed to stay there. But here's the flag, the flame coming in with a good piece of corporate imagery. Good heavens, they went over the top with their symbolism, didn't they? But, of course, this Games is famous for Jesse Owens rather blowing the master race idea out of the water, because he won 4 gold medals in the sprint and long jump. And the host country did actually get the most medals, 89, but the United States came second with 56. By 1937, this is a Hudson coupe, which shows the streamlined look and nice rounded corners to give an airflow over them. But also 1937, the second one of those Orient ships, and in this one I think they got it right. There were a few little rough edges on the Orion, the first one, and often with Mark II you get those mistakes out of it. Lovely little ship. Sadly she didn't survive the Second World War. But this is the first class dance space. I mentioned on the other one that there were the galleries beside the funnel. That's where you came through. The lounge was at the front. The interesting thing about this is that you notice that it's ordinary decking in the dance floor. Why would that be? Well, it was a devious little trick by the Orient Line, because dues to go through the Suez Canal were calculated by tonnage. 100 cubic feet is a gross ton, and it's a measure of enclosed volume. So they had side screens that they were able to fold back. So, sorry Gov, it's not enclosed, it's open. So they reduced the cost of the fees by throwing those sliding folding doors open and regarding it as open deck space, and part of the subterfuge was that it was ordinary decking, not an internal linoleum floor. The dining rooms show that lighting was integrated with the ventilation. Linoleum floors, they didn't do carpets in those days, which gave British ships a very strange smell of soap and polish, which lives with me to this day, because the first ship I ever went on was an Orient Line ship in 1958, and we were getting a bit better with lighting by that time. But look at that reef knot in the carpet. I believe that's another Marion Dawn. And do you remember those tubular tungsten lights that you used to get? They actually made a whole light fitting out of a cluster of them. I'm not sure the light from it would have been particularly pleasant, but as you can see, the curtains are light, there's no heavy furnishings, no clutter. But this room, the tavern by the swimming pool, has simple tubular chairs, very much like the Barcelona chair I showed you, and they had them in the nightclub on the Normandy as well. And you might notice by this time that windows are getting a horizontal emphasis. This sort of streamliner style was becoming very prevalent in windows. Look at the shop windows, three levels, horizontal bands, and even the stair rail has horizontal bars as to make the balustrade. This one I like because it shows an integration of design between that checkerboard screen the checkerboard carpet and the upholstery. A real integrated design job of walls, floor and upholstery. That was quite revolutionary to be that integrated. P&O was in the same group as the Orient Line. They did the Straths, and I showed some pictures of the Strathnaird and Strathaver. The fifth one, Strathallan, which again didn't survive the war, they did start to pick up that 30s look. Better light fittings in groups of 3, lighter furnishings, but P&O tended to hang on to the dark wood finish, where Orient Line went to light and white and that sort of thing. This is the embarkation foyer on the Strathallan. In transportation, when streamlined trains were all the rage. It was much more common to go by train than by air in those days, and the 20th Century Limited is seen here leaving Chicago in 1938. And to sell it, there's the poster with 4 of those engines racing together, announcing the 20th Century Limited. 16 hours between New York and Chicago. It was an all-room train, the first all-room in America. But built in Italy again for the Bergen Line, the rivals to Fred Olsen across the North Sea at the time. The designer Gustavo Pulitzer Finale did the interior of this, and as you can see, they were playing with ceilings, with step ceilings and light in the steps. So the Vega was a ship that they had on the North Sea at that time. Now we start to get to a revolution in ship design. It's probably sad to account that the Nazis invented the cruise ship. These ships, 2 ships, Robert Ley and the William Gustloff, were built for the strength through joy moment. They didn't have a long season. They were finished in 38, 39, so they only had the summer of 39. Fairly conventional on the outside, and on the inside a scraped, simplified, it wasn't really decorated as such, but it was like a lot of German architecture at the time. It was simplified down to simple rectangular forms and minimalist detail. But when you look at the upper parts, you realize where the heritage of modern cruise ships come from. There's no holds for cargo, there's no derricks, all sun deck and open air deck on the back, engines slightly aft, and the superstructure built well forward. So in many respects this is the granddaddy of a lot of purpose-built cruise ships, because she was designed purely for pleasure. There was no transportation role in them at all. A very short life, both of them were lost in the war. Then we really get flights of fancy. By 1938, the Fiat Tagliero service station is an extremely famous Art Deco building, and it was built in Italian Asmara. The architect was Giuseppe Petazzi, and it's one of the most important Art Deco buildings in the world, and it gave the city Asmara the UNESCO approval to be a World Heritage Site in July 2017. But that, I think, is everybody's dream of a modern villa. The rounded glass corners, the streamlined windows, bands and overhanging roofs. An absolute delight. I wish I could have that. But London Underground also had a design partnership of a person on the board who promoted good design, and Charles Holden, the architect who delivered it. And this underground station is Gants Hill in East London, near Ilford. And it was designed in the late 1930s, but due to the war it wasn't actually opened until December 1947. The tunnels going to Gants Hill were actually used for aircraft production. My dad worked on fitting those out for making radar and aircraft parts. The tunnels had been built, but the lines hadn't been laid, so they converted it to a deep factory for making air parts, and they finished it off in the war, and it was opened in 1947. South Beach, Miami has its Art Deco district with these sugar almond colours and interesting shapes, and that's known as the Art Deco district. Even in Mumbai it was adopted extensively, and there are a lot of interesting 1930s buildings. I was wandering around craning up at them the other day, and I found a 1930s filling station very near where we got out of the ship. And it was absolutely stunning. I haven't downloaded the pictures yet. I'll put it in the next edition of this. But there's a lot of Art Deco in Mumbai. In Scandinavia, they went to Italy for their ships, and in the 1939 the Stockholm was built. It was delivered in October 41, laid up and then bombed. So a ship that subsequently came in called the Stockholm, the one that ran into the Andrea Doria, was a replacement of it. But look at the interior, an absolutely beautiful piece of stunning modern design with a coffered ceiling and lovely furniture. You wouldn't be surprised to walk into a cruise ship and see a room like that today, would you? So, coming nearly to the end of the 1930s, I mentioned that chap Raymond Loewy, the one with the tram car and that did the United Airlines. He was the designer of 3 little ships that were designed to shuttle between the east coast of the United States and the Panama Canal zone, where the Americans, of course, had built the canal using railway technology in 1912, and they kept it supplied by these 3 very practical and lovely little ships. The Panama went to President Line and became the President Hoover, and then went to Chandris as the Regina. Did anybody sail on her as the Regina or Regina Prima? No? She was around until a few years ago. The State of Maine became a training ship in 1962, and the Cristobal carried the service on until they ended it and went to containers and air travel in 1981. But that very business-like little ship, sturdy, American, solid, with a lounge that was double height even on quite a small ship like that. What a beautiful room. It wasn't symmetrical, the staircase came down on one side. There's another one of those lozenge watches there. But I think that's a beautiful room for a very workaday ship that was just shuttling staff and goods back to the Panama Canal. But at the end of the decade, probably the greatest American ship that was built in that time was the SS America. William Francis Gibb, who'd previously designed Malolo for Matson Line, which went between the West Coast and Hawaii, and some Grace Line ships, designed this ship. It was Mark I, because the last liner I talked about on the Great Liners talk, the United States, was his masterpiece from 1952. But this was effectively Mark I and was the running mate for the United States. And this is really where the story of American ship design comes to a crescendo. There's the lounge and the ballroom. Now, I don't think by any stretch of the imagination one would call that Art Deco. It's modern, isn't it? It's just very simple modern, with a lovely mural and a recessed dome ceiling. That was the smoking room. But I think the loveliest picture I found of her was her first-class cocktail bar. Now, don't forget, this was only 7 years after Prohibition ended, but they evolved a really stylish cocktail bar. Imagine going across the Atlantic and having your martinis in that. So, let's bring those thoughts to an end, or together. Art Deco was actually a handy term that rolls off the tongue nicely. It's one of those words like environment that you sort of understand, but it's actually not that easy to define. In fact, it was the style that wasn't, because it was named in 1968 by the author of this book, Bevis Hillier. And it has Art and Deco from a bit of the name from that 1925 exhibition. So it was a retrospective name. People say, and I got very annoyed at the Victoria and Albert Museum the other day, last year, when they said designed in the Art Deco style. No, it wasn't. People didn't design in that style. It's only retrospectively now that we sometimes, oh, let's design a replica in Art Deco style. It was a name that was given, but what designers were doing was being different, often daring and experimental, breaking away from the traditions of design that they'd had before. Very often form followed function. And the streamliner style was often called art moderne. But really, it's just all branches of mid-20th century modern design. And it went to sea shortly after 1925. So with that, that's my fourth talk. I do have more in this decade series. 1940s from torpedoes to triumph, 1950s from rationing to rock and roll, 1960s from reverence to revolution. But sadly I don't have the slots to give them to you this time. So if you meet me again, I'll try and do the other decades. But for the time being, I hope I've explained how Art Deco went to sea in the 1930s. Thank you.